My name's Ali Miller and I'm here at the penultimate day of the Edinburgh International Book Festival to talk this morning to Michael Rosen. Morning, Michael.
Good morning to you.
How are you?
Very well, yes.
Good. And now you're obviously best known for your children's work, but you're here today as part of the adults programme. Can you tell me what you're doing?
I'm talking about a book I wrote called Good Ideas, How to Be Your Child's and Your Own Best Teacher. And it's a book, if you like, about parenting or grandparenting or auntying and uncling with children in relation to education in the very, very broadest sense of the word.
Mm-hmm. So how does that fit with kind of what we've become as modern parents, do you think?
Yes, interesting question. Well, I think as modern parents, certainly I'm speaking here about England and Wales, so I can't really speak about the Scottish situation, but in England and Wales the education system has got very, very controlling. It's very, very much in the hands of the exam boards and the exam system. So it's getting more and more tailored. The day-to-day experience of children in schools is to fit in with the exams and the tests. So if I take the example of my 14-year-old daughter, we sat down last year and said, I asked her, how many times do you think you're doing a test? And it worked out that about once a week she had some kind of test. And this is to gear in with the system as a whole. So these weren't external tests, there was tests. So it's like what I call a test crazy regime. So obviously parents feel bound to fit in with that. And I think that, if you like, engenders a certain kind of anxiety and a worry, and parents are constantly worried how their children are going to do in the test rather than, broadly speaking, with education. So I think that's a bit of a problem, because education is not about testing, it's about being educated. And the two things don't necessarily fit together. Quite often I don't think they do. So particularly if we're thinking about open interpretation of things, about being creative, about holding two opinions in your head at the same time, all very important things, or inventing things, just simply inventing ways of looking at the world, discussing things. So sometimes that doesn't fit in. So really this is a book about those more open ways of learning.
And how do we reclaim some of the more open ways of learning?
Well, at the very start of it, I think what we have to do is think of the child as being potentially curious. Now, quite often we think of children as empty vessels that it's our job to fill up. If you like, that's the worst side of education, that they have a curriculum and their job is somehow or other to pour that into children, to inject them with it, to get it. This is not teachers' fault, but this is exams, because exams appear to be places or times, if you like, where you have to regurgitate the slab of knowledge. But I'm interested in the idea that what we can do is engender curiosity, and through curiosity we discover the things that we want to know and want to learn, and that's the great motor for learning, because we then get the satisfaction. We've asked the questions, we've found out something, this feels good, I'll do some more. Parents, we're with our children for much more time than schools are with them, and so we can perhaps do that, we can engender that curiosity. So that means thinking all the time that children's questions are valid when they say, why is the sky blue, or what's that man doing over there, whatever it is. We don't dismiss it and think of it as a childish question. We go, well, I don't know, I wonder how we can find out. Or, well, actually that reminds me of, so we find open-ended and creative ways of supporting their curiosity.
So I suppose it's also about taking the responsibility back as parents, instead of seeing the schools as the situation of learning.
Yes, I wouldn't want to make the things mutually exclusive. I wouldn't want to say, oh well, all that teachy stuff, all that school stuff is irrelevant. Far from it. That the curiosity stuff, if it goes in tandem with the knowledge, then the children can approach the knowledge in a different way. And a lot of this comes from my own childhood, where I had a very formal education system, which many children found very, very difficult and fell by the wayside, because we had a system, in England, of the grammar school system, where 2/3 were junked at 11 anyway, because they hadn't managed to get hold of this stuff that they were supposed to get hold of. And I was very lucky to have very, I don't know how to say the word, I was going to say curious parents. They were curious, but what I mean is they were parents who could engender that curiosity. They asked questions themselves about everything. They argued with the radio, they argued with the telly, they read things and read out loud what the things they were reading. So I can just remember that home was this very sort of stimulating and arguing sort of a place. And in a way, the book's trying to say, well, go on then, go on. If when you have arguments, share them with your children. I don't mean rows, I mean, arguments with the world around you. And I tell the story that David Attenborough tells, actually, that when he was a kiddie, he used to go out on walks and pick up bones and stones and stuff. He was interested in them. And he'd come home, and his parents had some friends staying with them, and his parents were educated people, and he would come home and he'd say, look what I found, what is it? And instead of telling him, they would say, I don't know. I wonder if we can find out. Now, they may have known. So if he found a jawbone, most people know what a jawbone looks like, but instead of saying, oh, it's a jawbone, instead of cutting it off, they would go, I don't know. And they would get books down off the shelves and say, see if we can find out. Well, we have the internet now, and if you find an old bone or something like that, you can, working with Google and Google Images, you might be able to find out. So in a way, it's picking up partly from what David Attenborough was saying.
So it's taking the cues from children and then going with what their interests are and where it fits. But it's an interesting point you make as well about going to the shelf and getting the book. So it's taking children to books. Now, you're a professor of children's literature at Goldsmiths. How important is it to you that children have books?
Well, I think books are very important. They're not, I don't want to pretend that somehow or other stuff that you can get in books you can't get anywhere else at all. There's one or two things, but obviously, we do have this wonderful window on the world that is the internet. There are wonderful films, wonderful radio programs, wonderful apps of one sort or another that you can find on the internet. Books are very portable, and also they're very convenient for laying out on the floor. Now that may seem very trivial, but the number of times I've seen my own children take books and comics and printed material of any sort, it could be football programs, it could be anything, and lay them out on the floor and compare. What they're doing in academic terms is comparing and contrasting and browsing. Now, this is low down on our list of priorities with children. We think of literacy as the thing you do in front of a piece of text immediately in front of you, or we think a book that you pick up and read from beginning to end. I actually think that the activity of, if you like, almost playing with books and texts and browsing through them is as important as the other things, because what you're doing is scanning to find what you want. You're selecting and you're creating categories. Now, I've seen children as young as 4 and 5 doing this. This is making yourself at home in the world of the printed page, or for that matter, words on the screen. You're learning how to surf. That's what we've got a modern word for it, but the old word was browse. And I can't exaggerate how important that is. Now, you can do it on the internet. It's actually quite difficult to put up 10 things all at the same time. Possible, but difficult, particularly on a small screen. But you can have 10 books and you can sit there and talk about your 10 books with your mates. You can sit there and go, hey, look at that one, or what about that one? You go over to the shelf, you pull it off. Now, you can do that in the library. You can do that. You can go with a friend, and I used to do it. It's one of my memories as a child, going to the library on Saturday mornings, and we used to pull books off the shelf, and he'd have 3 or 4, I'd have 3 or 4, and we'd go, hey, look at this one. I think that's like going into almost a metaphorical room of literature and non-fiction. You sit in amongst the books, there's a physical aspect to it, and you are at home with them. And I think that's very important.
And yet we're currently facing library closures of Sure Start centres, benefit cuts, and I recently was thinking about this quite a lot, that obviously the very influential part of childhood is the first 5 years, which is the same term of a government as well.
Yep.
So there are children up and down the country who are effectively being damned to a certain extent. What do we do about this?
I think you're absolutely right. That is the eye of the storm. At the very moment that governments are talking about literature, literacy, entitlement, all these kind of words they use, they are in fact taking away with the other hand. Now, for people who are reasonably well off or in the book world, then in a sense we go, oh, well, that's not really a problem, I'll just go and get some books. But for those who haven't and don't have that way of thinking, then you're basically saying, well, the only place you're going to get that stuff is in school. Now, if at the same time in school there's more and more pressure to do literacy but not literature, literacy but not non-fiction, because you're just doing what Americans call basal readers, in other words, the initial readers, the learning how to read books. Then with our 3, 4, 5 and 6-year-olds, they're basically having pretty mean gruel, pretty lean fare, because it's bit bat bot, but bit bet bat, that type of stuff. You know, it's not even Dr. Seuss. I mean, Dr. Seuss worked with limited vocabulary, but it wasn't phonically regular, which is what's demanded by the English, possibly the Welsh, but certainly the English system, that this is what they should be doing. So I think absolutely, you know, just a few weeks ago, our Secretary of State for Education in England, Nicola Morgan, she said, got a wonderful idea. She was going to make it possible for all children, all 8-year-olds in schools to have a library ticket. And of course some people said quite rightly, well that's great, but what if you haven't got a library because you've taken it away? Whereupon the government turned around and go, well, it's not us taking it away, it's local government, which is just a sleight of hand. And at the same time they're saying, well actually, isn't it interesting, they're giving these library tickets to 8-year-olds. When I made the proposal to the schools minister about 3 years ago, I said, for very good reason, these have to be for 4, 5 and 6-year-olds, school entrance and in the first year. Isn't it interesting it shifted to 8 because of a doctrinaire attachment to the idea that children should only have these basal readers, these initial reading phonic stuff, and they shouldn't have literature in the broad sense of the word, where the wild things are, the Gruffalo, this sort of thing. They shouldn't have it. So, yes, I am, how can I put it, angry. What can we do about it? We can talk about it and we can get together, we can join in campaigns to try and save our libraries and point out the wicked contradictions that are going on.
Well, thank you so much for talking to us. I'll let you go now so that you can go to your event, but thank you, Michael.
Thank you very much. Thank you.